Hello and welcome to another episode of A Coffee with Chris, brought to you in association by Big C, our charity partner who help local people affected by cancer, and proudly sponsored by Hill Coaching Company, here to help you become a better version of yourself today. Now let's welcome today's guest, partner and head of sport and employment at Leathes Prior, Dan Chapman. Leathes Prior, for those of you that don't know, are one of East Anglia's leading law firms, offering a full range of legal services for over 145 years. They know what they're talking about. Dan, welcome to the podcast. Let's kick off with this question. What are the reasons for business leaders like yourself for jumping onto LinkedIn and doing thought leadership content and taking it seriously?
Good afternoon, Chris. Thank you very much for having me. I feel suitably honoured. Well, to answer that question, I think it's a complete no-brainer. If I rewind 20 years ago to when I was starting out as a lawyer, the only ways in which you could really promote yourself were in person. So it might be business lunches, business breakfasts, writing articles, so sort of offline content, but that was extremely time consuming. The travel to a lunch in the hope that you might meet someone vaguely interesting was very, very time consuming. The beauty of social media is it doesn't need to take much time. It's often free or certainly not hugely expensive. So why wouldn't you? I mean, it would just be madness, it seems to me, for business not to take it seriously.
What a great opener, Dan. I think it's always important to start with the why, because there's still this perception that, doing thought leadership content on LinkedIn is this kind of fluffy thing that it might work, it might not. And we'll get on to your how and the successes you've seen off the back of it as well, and specifically how you combat with that within your industry, Dan. I wanted to talk to you about thought leadership content specifically because it's been the thing that I've been the most impressed with. Well, one of the things I've been most impressed with since we've been connected, Dan, is how you've really grabbed LinkedIn and you've really made it your own. And I wanted to ask you, especially for the people that are in similar worlds to yourself, Dan, is how have you got so consistent with LinkedIn, and how do you stay on top of the industry latest to create thought leadership content?
I think probably two questions there. In terms of staying on top of the industry latest, that frankly has to be part of your job, your business, whether you're a professional, whether you're in any business. For me, if you're not passionate about it, you're in the wrong job or you're in the wrong business. So my job is to know what's going on, whether it's the employment world, the sports world, but even the business world. I'm an employer. I employ 130 odd people locally. So perhaps I'm nosy, but I make it my business to know what's going on. And then having made that effort to know what's going on, then why not take advantage of that? You've done 90% of the work. And I think it's getting into the mindset that social media shouldn't be a time-consuming drag. It should be the cherry on the icing. You've done the hard work. So just get something out there that shares your thoughts.
You've said there, Dan, the why of this, and I'm desperate to know though, how have you got so consistent, Dan? Because as you've said, you're at the top of the tree of such a well-established, local, trusted organization with such a fabulous reputation. So how do you stay on top of it? Well, how have you got so consistent, Dan? I'm fascinated to know.
For me, I'm not sure if this would work for everyone, but I think it's important to have a bit of structure in your working week or your day and have some time in which you do things. I'm a morning person, and when I'm having my morning cup of tea, I'm looking at the news. This morning I'm analysing the latest odds of the US president election. I'm thinking, what might the implications of that be for our country or our clients, if any? So for me, I'm quite disciplined in using my early morning time to see what's going on, both sort of globally, but more importantly, locally. And last week, there's lots of things with the budget that impact our clients. And then when I get to my office, before I throw myself into the working day, I think, having read what I've read this morning, is there anything I need to share? And you say I'm consistent, Chris, but I would actually, I'm not sure I consider myself to be consistent. I would say I'm consistently inconsistent in that I don't want to say something for the sake of it. I will see if there's something that I think might be relevant and useful, add some value. And then the first thing I'll do in the morning is either share that or perhaps draft it to share later. But 9 times out of 10, I have nothing to say on any given day. No one wants to hear from me, and it's best I move on. So yeah, consistently inconsistent is my approach.
I think you're being too humble, Dan. I think you are consistent, and you're consistently serving and not selling. And this is something that I try to coach, and within my consultancy work with Reef Social Media as well, we always try and tell people about this. You just naturally have this mindset with your LinkedIn content of, well, I've read the news. Now, how can I interpret this and help people with this? Because as you said before we started this broadcast, Dan, you'd mentioned to me that it's just so important for you to help people and use it as a tool for that. And then off the back of that, all of the wins come, which we'll get into in a minute. Dan, I'm very aware that what particularly impresses me about your thought leadership content on LinkedIn is the fact that you're doing this within a regulated industry, a heavily regulated industry. And we work with lots of financial clients and customers, and the list goes on in terms of those regulated industries. What would you say to those people that are kind of watching this, listening to this now, that work within a regulated industry, that want to take control of their profile and help their business on LinkedIn, but they don't necessarily know the starting point? Perhaps they're almost scared, dare I say, to jump on LinkedIn and do what you do. So how do people start, Dan?
Yeah, I think it's a valid point, and it can be a bit scary because whilst anybody who posts on social media risks some backlash if they say something that they might later regret, as a solicitor and as accountants, as financial advisors, you could be struck off. I mean, there are solicitors that have been severely sanctioned for social media posts. We might come on to that. So you have to recognize that risk, but it shouldn't be used as a reason to not do it, because the way I look at it is that actually it does put off. 95% of lawyers in this country are scared to do it. So what a great opportunity it is to be part of that 5% that are brave enough. And of course, be sensible, perhaps draft your posts, sometimes reflect on them. And I've often drafted posts and walked away and got on with my day and come back to it later on because it's perhaps a little bit edgy. But see it as an opportunity, not a threat. And if you're a young professional joining a firm, one of the difficulties is that there might be a marketing team, there might be even a social media team, there are brand guidelines, there are lots of rules, then your regulator has lots of rules. So everybody's just telling you to not do it, or all you see is jeopardy. But it's just switching that around and thinking, that's going to put most people off and it's not going to put me off. And therefore I can stand out as a result.
I think that's amazing advice, Dan. And my advice to add on top of that is for people in regulated industries that are scared, that are worried, that are concerned about, being struck off, having things happen to them off the back of their social content. And that's the knife edge that you play on with thought leadership content, right? When you're talking about something that's so newsworthy right now. And often we don't know all the answers. And so what I always say is just talking about something, and even talking about something with a headline and asking a question to your audience, is better than not saying anything at all. So you don't need to know all the answers. You don't need to share all the details. And you could just share that post, share something newsworthy, and ask a question to your audience. This will be really interesting for your industry. What do you agree with that, Dan?
A great example would be last week, the budget. There was some unexpected changes to national insurance that impacts employers. And one of the things we have to be conscious of is to not get too political. It may be that half of our client base voted for this government. Perhaps half of our client base didn't vote for this government. Doesn't really matter. As a country, we voted for it. And I think some lawyers would be very scared to give an opinion on the Chancellor's policies. But there's nothing wrong with reporting what they are. And as you say, throwing it out to your readers. How does this impact you? How does this impact your business? How can we help? And sometimes I see on some of my posts, some of the comments can be quite partisan, quite controversial, but that's fine. They're not your comments. You're not going to get struck off because someone has put a controversial comment in response to your very objective article. So let others be controversial. You don't have to be the controversy.
I love that, Dan. And you've got quite a knack, though, of I'm going to praise you a lot on this podcast, Dan. You'll have to get used to it. What you do very well is the detail, though. And so how you're consuming what's going on in the working world, the business world, the world full stop, and translating that for your LinkedIn account, making it into a thought leadership piece, but you're able to share the detail with, I guess, not going too far. And so, like, do you have any advice around that for people as well, Dan?
So I look at this as no different to walking into that business lunch 20 years ago, or walking into it indeed today. And you wouldn't walk into a business lunch and bore people with loads of irrelevant detail. I look at some posts and we all see them. You've switched off halfway through. And you wouldn't talk to somebody like that. So I look at my post and think, would I be able and willing to have this conversation face to face with some potential clients? And if the answer is no, then I don't want it on my LinkedIn post. It needs to be something you would be proud to talk to, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And Dan, I'm gonna kind of tease you out of this one. You did actually say something to me offline before we started, which is how I can tell a good guest is going to be a good guest. You were chomping at the bit to talk about this, and you said something about a social media post has to create emotion, and that's actually quite well known within the marketing world, but not so much in your world with that respect your way. So, what's your opinion on that? Because I'm sure you would agree, in your world, in finance, in many regulated industries, the content goes on LinkedIn and you're practically falling asleep before you've even read the headline, right? So how do you create emotion, but yet not go too far, Dan? I'm really intrigued by that.
No, it is a fine line, isn't it? And you have to... Example, we'll see it in the coming days. We'll have the outcome of the US election, whichever way it goes, and you'll see an outpouring of very neutral articles from all sorts of professional sectors telling you what the global impact that the new president of the United States will have. It will be boring. You wouldn't walk into a pub and start talking to people in such boring, neutral terms. So just because you're a professional, it doesn't mean you have to be boring. You know, you've got to find a way to make it interesting. So I do think it's a bit, you know, it's the pub test. Would you be willing to have this conversation in the pub, or you know, anywhere that you might tend to frequent on a social basis? And there's nothing wrong with trying to add a little bit of humor, a little bit of emotion. That doesn't cross the line between being professional and unprofessional in my view, and show a bit of character. Clients are going to want to see a little bit of character.
Dan, I might steal that within my coaching consultancy now. Dan Chapman's the pub test social media filter. I love that. I think that's a genius suggestion. Dan, it would be disingenuous for us to do this podcast, talk about thought leadership content, the fact that, of course, the upside is incredible, right? By sharing something that's hot right now, that's in the news, your opportunity for virality, for large scale reach is absolutely there. But we have to talk about the other side of the bridge, the other side of the coin, which is what can be the downside to this, and perhaps, especially given your profession, what could go wrong legally, and what are the traps, and how do people avoid the social media legal traps, please?
Yes. So, well, the traps, if I talk about the legal profession, but I'm sure the principles are very similar in lots of regulated sectors. And it's common sense when you think about it. You can't post anything that is discriminatory and would be considered to be unlawful if it was said face to face. And so, for example, people are entitled by law to have a particular religious belief or a political belief. And therefore, you've got to make sure that your posts are not discriminating against people for having the views that they have, or in any way targeting or taking advantage of whether it be vulnerable individuals or certain sectors of society. The other point is that we have a duty, not unreasonably, to act with integrity, to uphold the rule of law. And you always have to look at your posts within that prism. I always remember one quite high profile example a number of years ago. There was a lawyer who came out of court, criminal court, and he took a selfie, put it on LinkedIn, just won a court hearing, instruct me if you want to win. And on the face of it, it was a marketing post. It transpired that he hadn't won that hearing. And the opponent on the other side saw that post and thought, well, hang on, you've just lost that hearing, absolutely. And it ended up in the hands of the regulator. And what he thought was a innocent marketing opportunity was dishonesty, because it's false advertising. You can't walk out of court and say you just won when you've lost, or in fact walk out of court if you weren't even in the court in the first place. You've just taken but it's common sense, Chris, isn't it? It's just be a good person. Don't embellish. Don't falsely represent anything. Don't do anything offensive or discriminatory. And I'll give you some credit, because you said lots of nice things about me. But I remember attending one of your training sessions a number of years ago. And do you remember? I don't know if you still do this. You talked about weeing.
Yes.
If we cannot sound too vulgar, and that what a lot of professionals have a tendency to do on social media is talk about themselves. We, and it's a really awful habit in our profession, where every year people talk about where they've been ranked in these publications, and whenever I see that, I always think of you, Chris, because that's people just weeing everywhere, isn't it? Talking about themselves, and that's where people get into traps, because they misrepresent things in their desire to perhaps say something even more exciting than what they said the week before. They inadvertently fall into traps, and they get caught out.
Well, thank you for sharing that lovely. I actually remember doing some consultants at Leathes Prior. Massively enjoyed working with you, Dan. That was too many years ago now, which is quite scary. Lovely point, well raised, about weeing everywhere. And when you make that switch from weeing everywhere to the mindset you've got down, which is serving, not selling, making it about your audience and not about you. And then also, just to tap into the story that you've shared there about disingenuous social media content, that's kind of what I was hoping you'd say, Dan, because there is a problem, particularly on LinkedIn, where it's the Porsche 911. Hopefully you don't drive Porsche 911, Dan, but it's that kind of like, here we are, I'm standing, here's me with my Porsche 911, I've just won my case, but actually, if you've not, you can get in trouble for that. And I do think now audiences and people in general are quite suspicious anyway when they see that content, because they can just look on Companies House and see the evidence. But I just wanted you to say that, because there are, Dan, you can get in trouble. And I do fear that people are potentially wanting to kind of try and cheat social to get that reach, but not realize the legal implications. So thank you for sharing that. Dan, let's do a bit of the how, because you've made it out as if it's just really easy and you just kind of do it and it's out there and you become a thought leader like you are on LinkedIn within the legal world. What's the how? What are your kind of, do you have a way, Dan, that you construct your content? Is there a way that you kind of write that makes it engaging, that shares the detail? Is there anything that you do that's perhaps a formula that other people could follow when it comes to the actual creation of your content?
I'm going to probably upset you here, Chris, because you want me to tell you something like that. I think for me it's a little bit more natural than that. I guess part of our job as a lawyer is we do tend to write a lot. We're forever writing legal documents or advice, and one of our main skills, I would hope, is translating often difficult information and explaining it to people in a user-friendly way. And so I'd be lying if I said it doesn't come too difficult. It's not too difficult for me, but I think the question is often posed to me from younger lawyers coming through and saying, where do I start? And it's starting small, isn't it? And I think you've probably advised this to many people, that when you do your first posts, they'll get hardly any views, hardly any likes, very little engagement. But that's not a bad thing, because this is when you're learning. So you want to learn in that sort of slightly quiet environment, and don't be disheartened by those early stages. I mean, it takes a long time, but so does building a relationship offline. You don't walk into a room and suddenly develop a rapport with a new client. That takes a long time as well. And I think the mistake some people seem to have is they think, right, I'm going to set up a LinkedIn account and I'm going to start writing amazing content and I'm going to see results straight away. And when I don't, I'm going to blame Chris, who told me that social media was a good thing to do. And in any other world, you wouldn't be that unrealistic about the pace of return. So I can't really answer your question other than to say, view it as a long-term game and find your own style, find your own way of presenting.
I think actually, Dan, well, apart from the end of that answer about me and social media, it was an incredible answer, because the action from this and what people can take from that is you do what's right for you. Yeah. And also, sometimes there is not a formula, there is not a 3-step process, there is not a blueprint for you to follow. And if you are someone that likes systems, that likes process, and you need like here's what I write here, then I put that, then I put, fine. But alternatively, Dan, it's refreshing to get your honesty, because actually what you do is you write your content based upon your own written skills, your passion, what you feel. And actually, I think that's brilliant advice. That actually doing that and just sharing that help, that support, I think that's absolutely invaluable, Dan. So I actually think that's a much better response than you've given yourself credit for again. What success have you seen over the years, Dan, from taking LinkedIn seriously? Because I know you've mentioned it there. We did a training session a number of years ago, and you know, since then there's absolutely no doubt I've seen you more and more. You know, and the content seems to be getting better and better. So you're clearly seeing some return and some fruits of your labor. So what sort of success have you seen? And this isn't and so the audience knows, this isn't like going to be a nauseating, oh yeah, look at me, I'm Dan Chapman and da 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 da. I actually want people to know that there is actually tangible gains from doing this, right?
Oh, absolutely. The tangible gains vary from direct instructions that I can point to. I can point to many clients who contacted me either directly via LinkedIn or emailed or phoned the office saying that they'd read a piece. Often it's something that you posted 2 years ago. I did a post to do with parents who have talented sons in academies and football clubs needing some legal advice. It's a fairly niche issue. And interestingly, often it's those quite niche topics that will generate returns, because people are out there hunting for somebody who has a voice on this fairly obscure point of law. And
2 years ago, Dan. 2 years ago. So you posted something 2 years ago, and then you've won some business off the back of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's happened regularly. But the other thing, Chris, I think about this, and I'm sorry to keep harping back to my sort of in-person, old-fashioned real-world analogy, but for me, social media content is often a validation of a pre-existing relationship. So I've had clients that I've done work with 10 years ago, and for one reason or another, they've not had a particular need to use a lawyer, or perhaps outrageously they've used other lawyers, but they've come across some content that they've seen, and it's prompted them to think, oh yes, I need to get back in touch with this guy. Now, I'm not sure that post in itself would have created a new client, but it's given them a reason to reconnect, to reach out. And that, I think, is no different to when you walk into the room and recognize somebody that you saw 10 years ago, and you think, you know what, I need to go over and reintroduce myself to this person.
I think that is like I'm so pleased there that you've shared the unsexy answer.
Yeah.
I think everyone's obsessed with this with new business, right? But they don't realize that by sharing consistent, engaging, interesting content on LinkedIn, for example, but social media in general, you can upsell to your existing clients. Client that's already booked with you will remember that they got some work done with you years ago, and they're actually, oh yeah, no, Dan was good. Leathes Prior were brilliant. I'll go and use them again. So, like, this is the thing that I think so many marketers are afraid to say, is that by just simply turning up consistently, leaving a digital footprint. Dan, you've shared a great point there, a great story about how you shared something 2 years ago. And this is the power of social media. Please don't overthink it. And Dan, you've shared so much invaluable advice. So thank you, mate. I appreciate that. If you were to kind of summarize, if you could maybe just say in a few short sentences, how do you become a thought leader on LinkedIn? What would you say?
I think you need to be passionate about your subject, love your business, love your topic, and just be yourself. Be brave, be bold, don't be reckless, but just go for it and apply the pub test, Chris. Don't forget the pub test.
I love the pub test. That's been my favorite thing that I've got from this podcast in a long time. Dan, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
No, my pleasure. Thank you.
And I won't ask, of course, where you can find Dan, because the answer is LinkedIn, and I'll make sure that that is connected, is tagged in all of the social media posts. Do check out Leathes Prior. They are my legal partner. I use them. I trust them implicitly. They are absolutely amazing at what they do. And also, once again, a huge thank you to you for tuning in. If you're watching back, listening back, let us know your thoughts and opinions. I'm sure Dan will get back to you on LinkedIn if you've got any questions or queries. As always, as well, a massive thank you to our charity partner, 𝗖𝗵𝗿𝗶𝘀, who help local people affected by cancer, and Hill Coaching Company, who are here to help you become a better version of yourself today. I'll see you this time next week for another episode of A Coffee with Chris.